Good afternoon, and welcome to this week's edition of Halftime Talk, a weekly podcast as part of our daily energy markets series, where we take a slightly deeper dive into some of the trends and issues that are impacting the market over a period of time and may become even more relevant as time passes. A deep dive opportunity. And no one better to have that with at this moment than Ravi Bhatiani, Executive Director of the Federation of European Tank Storage Associations based in Belgium, in Brussels. Good afternoon, Ravi.
Good afternoon. Nice to be with you.
And you, and you. In some of our previous conversations, we talked a lot about energy security, and one of the themes that you were putting forward in that conversation, which now seems to incredibly sensible and relevant, but I wanted to bring it forward as a kickoff point for our conversation, and that was that the OECD countries, which recently released a strategic petroleum reserve to try and calm oil markets, global oil markets, on the back of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, released 400 million barrels of oil under storage. But you have been advocating for some time that the OECD look at increasing their oil storage requirement. Currently, it's 90 days of imported oil cover that each OECD country is obliged to keep in storage. We see the Chinese now have soared past that number. There are by some accounts, up to maybe 100 to 150 days, depending on the data one looks at. But ultimately, a very big number of storage forward cover does China have. I wonder what your thoughts now, as we look at these events and look through to sort of hopefully some kind of end to the war in Iran, that these kinds of issues will resurface and the OECD will have to move forward and think a lot more seriously about your proposal.
I think that when it comes to the stocking obligations set down by the OECD members in the IEA, um, the reactions and the learnings will vary by region. And I can speak about Europe specifically, as we have done in the past. You know that for the last 6 or 7 years at least, we have been in a constant dialogue with European authorities and national stockpiling entities to try to anticipate the kind of crises that we see today. And specifically related to the Strait of Hormuz, it's not as if it is a giant surprise that this choke point has been closed. It's something that we have been trying to prepare for years and years. Almost every energy security problem scenario or contingency that one would prepare for at universities, in public life and government, etc., involved the closure of this choke point. And we have had adequate time to prepare for this with the experiences from sanctions, from conflict, from choke point closures over the past decade or so.
Only around the corner in Bab el Mandeb on the Red Sea, there's been a major flashpoint for the last few years.
Exactly. So I think rather than being reactive to crises, taking hits to GDP, having cost of living problems with all the political consequences that this entails, we should seriously be thinking about anticipating future crises, really working in line with the preparedness scenarios that we have in Europe, and look at expanding the strategic stockpiles, but in a clever way, not reliant on crude oil stockpiles, but reliant on product stockpiles. So we need to change stock composition towards diesel, towards jet fuel, simply to reflect the realities of European refinery output.
Well, if you take that point of learnings, and it's not a surprise that Strait of Hormuz, even my 10-year-old son could have told you that it's sort of there lingering like the boogeyman. Uh, but when you compound it with the idea that Europe has just come through such a probably the biggest energy crisis of their certainly the modern era, with the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, energy costs quadrupled or more in Europe. Countries had to provide subsidies, etc. Basic, mainly around gas rather than fuel oil or diesel, perhaps, but also diesel. Uh, where are the learnings? Where is Europe not paying attention? I mean, when you think about, implementing sensible policy in quieter times, when the house is on fire, they're not going to do it. Why would they do it in quieter times?
It's a very good question, and it's something that we are reflecting on. Um, why has there been no preparation? Um, we strongly believe that the offshoring of the European refining sector, the struggle to have surge capacity that would make a release of strategic crude reserves impactful have to be reassessed. How can we do this? It means a reassessing of stock composition, as I mentioned, away from crude oil towards refined products that citizens can actually use in a crisis. But it also means thinking about new kinds of stockpiles in Europe. For example, there is very little strategic gas storage in Europe. We have seasonal gas storage. One or two European member states have strategic gas storage of very small amounts. But given the reliance on spot markets and the cutoff from piped gas supply, it makes sense as well that we increase resilience through LNG strategic storage, I would say.
When you think about that as sort of a bigger idea, the just-in-time delivery economic reality that we've all come to live with, even if it's ordering our own chicken sandwich by Deliveroo or Uber Eats in the evening, nobody's storing anything is the economic model of the very big picture. Whether you're whether you're Volkswagen cars in Germany, you're relying on a very efficient supply chain of just-in-time parts to come in the factory on the day you need it, etc. Are we thinking here that the big legacy event, a big legacy takeaway of this moment, is the end of that era? Or we thought that COVID was the end of that era. Maybe this is just the punctuation point on the end of that era. How do you see that adaptation, that economic shift in what is a very different model? It's more reverting to what was inventories and warehouses, and rather than the just-in-time outsourcing, as you mentioned, refineries to the other side of the world.
The trend that you mentioned actually is reflective of the wider global shift. So we are moving from stability guaranteed by unipolarity towards volatility and a contested global environment, which is going to be symptomatic of multipolarity as countries, jurisdictions jockey for position on the global stage. And the consequence of this contested environment is exactly what we have been seeing over recent years: conflict, sanctions, um, risks related to choke points. And when you are in an import dependent jurisdiction like the EU, we're dependent on imports of critical raw materials. We're dependent on imports of energy products. We're dependent on imports of all kind of industrial imports. When the globe becomes more contested, as is the case at the moment, we have to start thinking about how to buffer shocks. And we can only buffer shocks by changing the way that supply chains are working, moving away from just-in-time principles towards principles more geared towards the geopolitical situation, which is preparedness principles.
If we look, take that idea and just look to the more immediate time frame that we're now living in. We're coming to the end of the first quarter. We're nearly 1 month into this U.S.-Israel-led war on Iran and the closure of the Straits of Hormuz, and with that, the shutdown of energy supplies leaving the Strait, leaving the Gulf, which is close to 20 million barrels of oil and products a day, and 20% of the world's LNG supply each day has been shut in. What does that mean for Europe going into the second quarter, I mean, in some ways it's been a fortunate timing because at least it's not the depths of winter and there's this energy shock that needs to be dealt with when you have immediate heating requirements. But it's going into the window of the year when European gas storage reservoirs have been emptied from the winter and it's buying time and refilling time. What does all of that look like for Europe going into the second, third quarter ahead of next winter?
Yeah, we have had a look at this. FETSA has a research arm. The part of our research that covers the topics you mentioned is done by an organization called Energex Partners. So I just want to make sure that I credit where the credit is due. We can split this reaction into refined products and gas, let's say. When it comes to LNG, we anticipate higher prices, most likely starting over the summer during the gas replenishment season for Europe. The gas replenishment season is for the winter storage, and it coincides with the time of highest temperatures in Europe. We have seen an inversion of the normal trend whereby we get higher prices during the winter because of climate change. So the increased need for air conditioning and cooling combined with gas storage pumping, let's say, this means that the high prices triggered by the shutdown of more or less 17 to 20% of Qatari LNG capacity, as well as the closure of the strait, will start to have a macro impact as we move through the summer and the next heating season. Um, in the
And
past,
that's if things correct themselves now, I suppose, like in the coming days, that full Qatar LNG production and exports somehow magically start to flow again. Although they had 17% damage that will be out permanently, and we've already had force majeure notices to Italy and Belgium, I believe, in Europe. If this drags on, how big an increase or escalation to the challenge does Europe face?
it faces a massive challenge if escalation in the conflict continues. Um, the escalation pathway for the conflict is relatively well reported at the moment in terms of gas infrastructure, energy infrastructure being hit, as well as desalinization infrastructure being hit. If we move on to that pathway, we expect price spikes for gas, rivaling those or going higher than what we saw during the start of the Russia-Ukraine war, where Russia throttled back gas prices. At the moment, it's possible that the market is underpricing this risk. I can move on to
Yeah, please go ahead.
the liquid products, refined
Yes,
products.
absolutely.
Here we have a much more immediate impact. Our research shows, based on public data from Eurostat, that approximately at March the 10th, Europe had approximately 23 days of commercial and strategic jet storage. We are now more or less 10 days after that date. There have been very, very limited exits of products from the Strait of Hormuz. Europe is now getting let's say, the last parts of deliveries that had already exited just as the war started. So from now on, if the conflict doesn't end or de-escalate in a rapid manner, I believe that we will start to see jet fuel shortages in Europe, very high jet fuel prices in Europe starting, mainly because as the EU, we have replaced dependence on Russian refined product supply with dependence on other non-European jurisdictions, notably dependence on Kuwaiti jet fuel supply.
And that, of course, is going into the peak demand period of the summer travel season in Europe.
Precisely. But if the conflict continues and the strait remains shut, I would fully expect demand reduction measures to be put in place.
And what could they look like within the context of Europe? We're seeing in Asia now 4-day work weeks, universities and government buildings being shut down, remote working, etc. That's already policy.
It depends on the product in question. If we are thinking about jet fuel shortages, then first, I suppose you'll have demand destruction through very high ticket prices, demand destruction through routes becoming logistically impossible if planes cannot refuel in Asia, for example. But at a certain moment, you may have demand restriction measures, for example, on business travel that's non-urgent, that requires you to take a flight. When it comes to products like diesel, I do not expect that there would be any imminent shortage of these products, simply price spikes, which could lead to some demand destruction in Europe. But in case of shortages, if the crisis were to be truly of a long duration, lasting many months, we have experiences of the IEA's demand reduction measures that were set out during the start of the Russia-Ukraine war when there was a diesel crisis. And these involve home office mandates, city centre, vehicle bans, and so on. But it would be quite an extreme scenario to get there. Then again, we are in an extreme scenario today. It's a question of duration.
Yes, it clearly is already reached to sort of break the glass and press the red button in parts of Asia and the more vulnerable, weaker economic environments that can't afford to compete for these elevated prices for jet fuel and diesel and others, and that will continue to rise as we've said. Looking at the situation, of course. Russia has been given by the Trump administration an exemption, a suspension of its sanctions on Russian oil on water in order to try and ease some of the crisis on supply side. Where do you think that leaves Europe? Again, Europe sits next door to a major energy supplier that has now become not very friendly due to the war in Ukraine. Has Europe got to revisit that relationship? Will it revisit? I mean, how has Europe effectively replaced Russian pipeline dependence even under these extreme circumstances?
Um, I think when it comes to pipeline gas dependencies, we have Repower EU, which has some immediate next steps happening. So a disconnection, for example, from short-term LNG contracts in April, and then short-term gas contracts, if I'm not mistaken, later on in June. There is an emergency brake within this piece of legislation which would allow a member state to declare a situation of energy insecurity, upon which moment the European Commission would have 5 days to issue a decision whether to, let's say, waive these rules for a period of time. So there is a certain amount of flexibility when it comes to gas. When it comes to the crude oil sanctions and refined product sanctions that are in force, I don't see any movement at the moment when it comes to a change in the position of the European Union. However, when you are in a situation of shortage, which might be the case if there is no de-escalation in the coming weeks and months, I suppose all scenarios would be on the table for how to get products into Europe.
I mean, given these sort of soaring prices and the point we talked about earlier, the idea of whether storage needs to be increased, you suggested that we need to reconfigure storage more towards LNG rather than other types. How viable is that? Will it be the capacity to do so we're dealing with such elevated prices with inflation? How viable is large scale storage investment without distorting markets or deterring LNG inflows?
I think it depends very much on the product. When it comes to investment in LNG storage capacity, it depends on the business case. Who is going to pay for this storage? Will governments see the need for strategic LNG storage capacity? Will the chemicals industry, for example, wish to have commercial buffers of LNG, which is becoming a commercial feedstock for the European chemicals industry? When it comes to diesel and jet fuel storage, where the investments would probably be less, I think there is a clear business case for financial investors to support such investments for strategic storage, which gives long-term stable returns to the shareholders of storage terminals.
That's one of the sort of challenges of that, isn't it? Ultimately, the market policy and management over the years, and particularly by OPEC Plus, is to keep the market in backwardation, to disincentivize inventory building in order to keep the market relatively tight on the front end. How do you see that being adjusted, or how could it be adjusted in order to facilitate some of the vision you've just shared?
Um, I think it will be very difficult to have an immediate and sudden buildup of storage capacity combined with a replenishment of that storage because that will impact prices. So any truly strategic level of storage replenishment that happens in Europe, it would have to happen over time. Um,
I mean, it's
I
what we've
think,
seen in China over the last 2 years. China has added 1 million+ barrels a day of oil to its strategic storage slash commercial storage. They don't really differentiate between the two, but ultimately it has been quite supportive and has contributed to the elevation of the front month oil price. It's sort of unavoidable in a way, and in some ways is seen as demand by the producers, and they seem somewhat happy with it.
yeah, and if you look at how China built out first built out its storage capacity over a period of 4 to 5 years, and then started replenishing it over a more or less 2 year period, you can see that in itself was quite a demand signal.
It certainly was, and they seem to be in probably on a global level, besides America, which has is blessed with riches under their ground. The Chinese seem fairly well placed to ride out at least the crisis as it's currently defined. If indeed it gets worse, I think everybody's sort of up the creek without a paddle, as they say. Just to finish off. In terms of the immediate where we're at now, Ravi, what do you think is likely to be the immediate impact for the second quarter into the summer in terms of market management, and then what it would be you think the most the most recommended legacy policy shift that you would advocate. But let's just start with what's your forecast for the most immediate impact as we go into second and third quarter. Does it take demand destruction, or will supply provide the solutions?
I think if you use the status of the conflict as it is today, with perhaps some level of de-escalation, due to the need for the warring parties to take some kind of operational pause to reconstitute, I believe that the impact on European energy markets, probably for the rest of this year, will already be impacted in terms of higher gas prices, as we have discussed earlier, until the year end, as well as in a worst case scenario, jet fuel shortages. In a best case scenario, high jet fuel prices. For diesel, in a worst case scenario, probably very high prices, and maybe at certain moments you will not have the product exactly where you need it, but without being in a true shortage scenario. I think as we move to the end of the year, we also have to look at how Europe has treated the IEA stock release. There is very, very limited participation by European nations in the IEA stock release. Why is this? It's because the national stockpiling entities in Europe anticipate the crisis will get worse before it starts improving. So they're keeping their powder dry. It's going to be very unlikely that national stockpiling entities will release refined products. It's also unlikely that they're going to release crude reserves unless they make very small releases in solidarity with Asian countries. But it means that Europe's keeping its powder dry with its 90 days of crude stockpiles and very limited supply of refined product stockpiles, precisely to try to ride out the summer season and autumn.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. There is so much to think about, Ravi, and I can't think of this subject being anything more important, really, and particularly, as you say, for Europe. It certainly has been a very big subject here in the Gulf as well, and we're going to see what the legacy strategy is around increased storage, increased regional infrastructure networks, whether it be pipeline and otherwise. There's certainly a lot of relief in the region at the moment that we have our integrated regional power grid up and running, and hopefully it won't be called upon, but in case it is, I think that kind of regional infrastructure does come much more to the fore in this region. Obviously, you have lots of internal grids and pipelines in Europe. But Ravi Bhatiani, Executive Director at the Federation of European Tank Storage Associations, thank you very much for being our guest on Halftime Talk this week.
Please, may I just take one last opportunity to convey my best wishes and courage to all the colleagues, co-workers in the industry who are undergoing a difficult time at the moment in the Gulf region.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.